Good morning everyone, I am Tey Miao Hui. I am a student of Master Degree Educational of Psychology. Today I am going to present about the research idea outline of my project. The title of the project is The Prevalence of Psychological Distress and Associated Factors Affecting Psychological Distress Level Among University Students in Malaysia. Let's move on to the content of the project. I'm going to explain about the research issue and also the research objective and research question. Next, I'm going to use Conceptual Framework to explain the relationship between the independent variable and also dependent variable. Besides, I also present about the research methodology and also expected finding. Lastly, I will talk about the contribution of the study and also the conclusion. As we know, mental health issue among university students has been growing, and it has become a growing concern, especially the issue of psychological distress. A lot of studies indicated that a great number of university students are facing the problem of student distress during their time in university. According to the reliable data, there are 55% of university students are suffering from excessive pressure, and the reason of getting psychological distress is because they are facing a lot of pressure and stress in their life. This problem may be caused by many factors, whether it is due to academic concern, psychological problem, relationship issue, or financial issue. Actually, this is very difficult and challenge for university students to deal with such great excessive pressure and stresses during their time in university, because they have to face the problem by themselves without others helping. At the same time, the lack of effective care and self-awareness about the psychological distress actually can frustrating them. As we know, psychological distress can lead to a lot of negative consequences. For example, poor academic result, health problem, psychological issue, self-harm, even suicide attempt. At the end of the study, the paper made a contribution to the field by establishing the relationship between the predictors of students' psychological distress and how these predictors determine the level of student distress among the population. Next, I will talk about the research objective and also research question. For this study, there are three research objectives. The first objective is to identify the prevalence of psychological distress of university students in Malaysia context. The second one is to study the relationship between predictors of student psychological distress and the level of student distress. And third is to study the predictors that contribute to higher level of psychological distress among the population. So next, I will use Conceptual Framework to explain about the relationship between independent variable and also dependent variable. As you can see, the Conceptual Framework shows the relationship between the predictors of psychological distress and also the student's psychological distress level. So there are 6 sub-skills under independent variable. The first one is academic, equity, relationship, practical, parenting, and also the health issue. After we determine the student's psychological distress level, the result can help us to identify how prevalence of psychological distress of university students in UTM. Next, I'm going to present about the research methodology of this study. For this section, we'll talk about the study design, research approach, population, instrument, sampling, data collection, and also data analysis. The research design of the study is correlation research because we want to study the prevalence of psychological distress and the associated factors affecting psychological distress level among the university students. At the same time, we also apply quantitative research method. This is because quantitative research allows the findings to be generalized for appointed populations, such as university students. At the same time, a lot of previous studies, they apply quantitative research method to measure people's mental health issue. And a lot of psychological distress studies has been associated with quantitative research design. Next, I am going to talk about the research instrument. For this study, online questionnaire will be used for data collection. Questionnaire was created by adopting two standardized questionnaires from GHQ and also USS. Section for GHQ is to measure the prevalence of psychological distress of the students, whereas USS is to measure the predictors of psychological distress and the extent of stress experiences by students. And the USS section consists of 6 sub-skills, which is academic, equity, relationship, parenting, practical, and health. I decided to adopt these 2 questionnaires because GHQ is an appropriate instrument to getting the data of psychological distress, and it has very high reliability. It is also a reliable tool for examining the mental well-being, such as depression, anxiety, and also social withdrawal, according to previous study. I use USS because this is the instrument that can collect the data of predictors of psychological distress, because it consists of broad category of life events that a student might have perceived as stressful, and this allows me to identify what event that cause their psychological distress. Questionnaire, the respondent need to respond to the questionnaire by using 4-point Likert scale. The questionnaire consists of 3 different sections. Section 1 will be focused on the general information of the respondent, and Section B will be focused on the data regarding to the student's psychological distress level, which is GHQ, and Section C is to collect the data regarding to the predictors of psychological distress to measure their psychological distress experiences. Next, I'm going to talk about the sampling and population. For this study, the samples are UTM undergraduate students. The sampling I use is random sampling technique, which means every student has chances to be selected as the respondent of the study. The questionnaire will be distributed via online. I will create the Google form to distribute the online questionnaire. The reason I choose to use Google form and also online survey is because this is cost saving and faster result analysis, and this is convenient for the participant to answer the questionnaire. The Google form will be spread to social medias such as Facebook and also WhatsApp group. So this allows me to reach more respondents. And next, I will talk about the data analysis. This study will apply SPSS version 26 to perform the data analysis. So this study also involves descriptive statistics, inferencing statistics, and also reliability tests. We will use table, figure, percentage, and also frequency to explain about the data. The test I'm going to use is Pearson correlation test and also regression test. Pearson correlation test will be used to identify the correlations between the independent variable and also dependent variable, while regression analysis will be using to determine which predictors were the most important determinants to higher level of psychological distress among the population. The score will be calculated for GHQ to summarize the prevalence of psychological distress among students, as well as USS to measure the predictors of psychological distress. Next, I'm going to talk about the expected finding. The objective of this section is to answer the research questions. So what is the prevalence of psychological distress? What is the relationship between the predictors of student psychological distress and the level of student distress? And what are the predictors that contribute to higher level of psychological distress? Will be discussed accordingly with the support from other relevant literature studies. In conclusion, this study can explain the prevalence of psychological distress of university students in Malaysia context, and the associated factors affecting psychological distress level among university students will be identified. So the contribution of this study is to increase the understanding of people about the phenomenon of students living with psychological distress. This study is expected to gain more knowledge about the psychological distress among the university students, as well as increase their understanding on associated factors that result in the psychological distress, At the same time, this study also can be used to increase the awareness of parents and teachers, because the involvement of parents, teachers, and the people around the distressed students and other also other social support is highly needed to help the student get away from the psychological distress. Also decrease the phenomenon to be getting serious in future. That's all for my presentation. Thank you so much.